The Hunkpapa Sioux didn't negotiate with trespassers. When Fort Lincoln's cavalry rolled toward Heart River, they walked into a trap. 100 warriors, hidden in the brush, turned a quiet escort mission into a desperate retreat. History calls it a clash. The Sioux called it justice. By the summer of 1873, the Northern Plains were less a frontier than a chessboard where every move drew blood. The U.S. Army had spent years planting forts across Dakota Territory, each one a stake driven into the heart of Lakota freedom. Fort Abraham Lincoln, thrown up in 1872, loomed on the bluffs above the Missouri River, glaring across at what's now Bismarck, North Dakota, like a landlord demanding rent nobody wanted to pay. It was the Army's crown jewel, home to the 7th Cavalry, a unit that thought their shiny sabers and starched uniforms could bully the plains into submission. General Alfred Terry, holed up in his Dakota Department headquarters, pulled the strings, but Fort Lincoln was run by Daniel Dandy Houston, an infantry officer with a face like weathered leather and a temper to match. His job wasn't just to keep the fort standing. It was to make sure the wagon trails stayed open, the railroad surveyors didn't get scalped, and the Hunkpapa Sioux, still roaming free, got the memo that their world was shrinking. The Hunkpapa, unsurprisingly, weren't big on memos. To them, every fort was a trespass, every road a wound, every surveyor's stake a declaration of war. Skirmishes weren't just common, they were the plains' heartbeat, each clash a test of who'd break first. The Army dreamed of order, the Hunkpapa dreamed of driving every bluecoat back across the Missouri. Lieutenant Carlo DeRudio was the kind of man who made the 7th Cavalry's officer roster read like a novel. A European revolutionary who'd cut his teeth fighting for Emperor Maximilian's doomed empire in Mexico. He'd seen more bullets fly by 30 than most men saw in a lifetime. After Mexico's collapse, he washed up in America, trading one war for another as a U.S. cavalry officer. At Fort Lincoln, he strutted with an aristocratic air, his mustache practically saluting on its own, but his eyes burned with the kind of fire that comes from surviving too many close calls. The Hunkpapa didn't care about his backstory. They hadn't signed any treaties, and they weren't about to bow to a man who thought his medals made him bulletproof. The plains around Fort Lincoln were their domain, a sprawling maze of hills and rivers they knew, like the lines on their hands. Every survey mission, every patrol was a middle finger waved in their faces. By June, the air was thick with bad blood, the kind that doesn't need a spark to ignite. It was already smoldering. The Army thought they could map the future. The Hunkpapa were ready to rewrite it in red. On the 10th of June, 1873, Fort Abraham Lincoln buzzed with the kind of false confidence that gets men buried. Lieutenant Carlo DeRudio, probably polishing his ego as much as his boots, got orders to escort 2 Army engineers to the Heart River, a deceptively scenic stretch of hills, gullies, and buttes just south of modern Mandan. It was the sort of mission that sounded like paperwork until you remembered the Hunkpapa were out there, watching, waiting, and not exactly rolling out the welcome mat. General Daniel Dandy Houston, barking from his infantry post on the hill, handpicked 20 men from the 7th Cavalry, 2 from each troop, as if neat math could outsmart a Sioux ambush. John Charles Creighton, one of the unfortunate riders, later recalled how they swung by the blockhouse west of the fort's stockade, grabbed the engineers, and headed north through hills that seemed to whisper trouble. DeRudio, with his Mexican war scars and a flair for the dramatic, probably thought he'd seen worse. Spoiler: he hadn't. The Heart River area was a trap disguised as a landscape. Its rolling hills and jagged buttes weren't just pretty, they were perfect for hiding an army. The Hunkpapa knew every dip, every shadow, every place a man could die without being seen. The cavalry, meanwhile, rode like they owned the place, their horses kicking up dust as the engineers scribbled notes, probably dreaming of bridges and railroads. It was the 19th century equivalent of live streaming your location in a war zone and expecting applause. DeRudio's men, sweating through their uniforms, acted like their rifles and ranks made them untouchable. The Hunkpapa, crouched in the brush, were about to deliver a reality check. The hills weren't just scenery, they were a stage, and the Sioux had already written the script. By noon, the cavalry would learn what happens when you ride into a story where you're not the hero. The 10th of June, 1873, was the kind of day that makes you wonder why anyone thought riding into Hunkpapa territory was a good idea. Lieutenant Carlo DeRudio's 20 cavalrymen, trailing 2 Army engineers like babysitters on a bad field trip, trotted down a narrow creek bed near the Welch farm, just south of modern Mandan. The landscape was a postcard from hell: rolling hills, jagged buttes, and a small bridge over the creek that screamed, "Trap," to anyone with a pulse. The Hunkpapa Sioux, at least 100 strong, were waiting, tucked behind rocks and tangled buckbrush, their rifles gleaming with intent. When the first shots rang out, it was like the hills themselves opened fire. Bullets snapped through the air, kicking up dirt and shattering the cavalry's confidence. John Charles Creighton, one of the riders, later said they held their ground for about as long as it takes to realize you've walked into a hornet's nest. The Hunkpapa weren't just fighting, they were conducting a masterclass in ambush tactics, their rifles, better than the Army's standard issue, turning the creek bed into a shooting gallery. Derrudio, with his aristocratic mustache and Mexican war stories, probably wished he'd stayed in bed. Outnumbered 5-1, the cavalry's bravado evaporated. They wheeled their horses and bolted, dodging lead as the Sioux pursued, popping shots from the high ground. Every rock, every bush seemed to spit fire. The retreat was less a strategy than a desperate sprint, the soldiers' boots barely touching the ground as Hunkpapa war cries echoed behind them. It wasn't a fight, it was a lesson in who really owned the plains, and the Sioux were the professors. Back at Fort Abraham Lincoln's blockhouse, the cavalry stumbled in, sweat-soaked and spitting dust, their egos as battered as their saddles. General Daniel "Dandy" Houston, probably pacing like a man who'd just lost a bet, didn't give them time to sulk. It was the 10th of June, 1873, and the Dakota sun was roasting the plains like a bad barbecue. Houston ordered Derrudio's men back out to drive off the Hunkpapa, as if a second round would erase the first. The soldiers, still tasting the Heart River ambush, climbed back on their horses, their faces grim but their options grimmer. The Hunkpapa hadn't vanished, they were out there, rifles ready, fighting like men who'd sworn to make the Army regret waking up. The counterattack was a brutal, sweaty slog, bullets zipping through the heat haze as the cavalry pushed forward. Creighton called it a pretty hot fight, which is frontier. Speak for, we barely survived. The Hunkpapa, outnumbered but not outclassed, held their ground until the cavalry's sheer stubbornness forced them back into the hills. No one threw a victory party. The soldiers returned to the blockhouse, miraculously alive, while the Sioux slipped away, probably chuckling at the Army's audacity. Fort Lincoln could claim they held the field, but the Hunkpapa had already won the story. The dust settled on the 10th of June, 1873, but the Heart River fight left echoes that lingered like gunpowder on the wind. The Hunkpapa Sioux, with their rifles and nerve, had shown a kind of bravery that made Fort Lincoln's cavalry look like they'd wandered into the wrong story. John Charles Creighton, one of the soldiers who lived to tell it, swore every Hunkpapa warrior must have woken up that morning vowing to make the Army regret their maps. The Sioux fought like men who knew the land better than their own shadows, each shot a reminder that the plains weren't for sale. Nobody counted the Hunkpapa dead, nobody dared get close enough. But Arikara scouts, loyal to the Army, dragged back 2 scalps, grim trophies that proved the Sioux weren't untouchable. The fight was over fast, a blur of bullets and sweat, yet the cavalry walked away without a single coffin to fill. It was less a miracle than a fluke, the kind of luck you don't bet on twice. The Hunkpapa didn't need to kill to win, they'd already made their point. Fort Lincoln could keep its flag flying, but the Sioux had carved their defiance into the buttes. Every soldier who rode back knew the truth. The Hunkpapa weren't fighting for glory, they were fighting for home. The Army called it a skirmish, the Sioux called it a warning. History, as usual, just shrugged and moved on. The Hunkpapa struck and vanished, leaving Fort Lincoln to lick its wounds. Their stand at Heart River wasn't just a fight. It was a promise the plains weren't tamed. History buries these moments, but they still burn. Subscribe, comment, and let's dig up more stories the textbooks forgot.